So we know what EMIYA is capable of normally, but what if we were able to stretch those thresholds a bit further? Well, recently I got a comment that was pretty interesting. Noah says, if UB-Dub has Rule Breaker, and we know that EMIYA can bend and morph his weapons into new ones, i.e. Calibolt, can EMIYA or EMIYA Alter make Rule Breaker into arrows or bullets? This is one of those concepts that should be restricted by all means just for how broken it sounds. But for the sake of this video, let's see what we can come up with. We know that EMIYA can create Rule Breaker based on instances like Shiro projecting one to use against Sakura towards the end of Heaven's Field. Medea's Rule Breaker allows you to neutralize nearly any magecraft, and this allowed him to separate Sakura from her immediate powers. Remember, the any magecraft idea was something that came out prior to all these new servants. Another time that we have is when EMIYA used the class card to bring out Rule Breaker back in Prisma EMIYA. It was one of the big turnarounds that they used against Darius. Not only did it negate the magecraft, but it negated Darius entirely because he was conceptually existing through displacement, and this knocked him out of his body. Extremely useful tool if you haven't looked into it. In terms of mana supply, it's never really been an issue. Rule Breaker has never been presented as a heavy cost efficiency weapon. Usually the big issue with Rule Breaker is just getting into range and being able to use it. It's extremely dangerous, and it would normally require a lot of setup for you to even consider those circumstances. That's one of the main drawbacks. But if you were to turn them into projectiles, arrows and bullets, for example, as he mentioned, then the only thing that really makes Rule Breaker bad or difficult to use now ceases to exist. So how would EMIYA go about filling in the gaps in between? Unlimited Blade Works itself is very well known for being a database for weapons, a true forgery. While EMIYA could project multiple versions of Rule Breaker, he would never do this because only one of them would maintain the data of the original. They would just be husks or hollow replicas of what Rule Breaker should be. Otherwise, you would just see him spam these all the time. And the reason for these types of things has always been shown to be due to a lack of energy. His inability to project is usually him just lacking the data or the reserves that are required to do so. He said it himself, even outside the extraverse, he could at least project Excalibur's image, but it would take his life in the process just because of the sheer amount of energy. It would destroy him from the inside. If we could make up the difference in this gap, then we could come up with something that's truly lethal. One thing that came to my mind, of course, being Zelrech. If he could use Zelrech's abilities, namely through the Kaleidostick, to tap into that limitless mana supply, he could make as many Rule Breakers as he wants at no cost to him, and they all would be the original thing. From here, he could just cast them down as projectiles as he would normally, and then the person would have to deal with an entire wall of Rule Breakers that could neutralize their magecraft. Or another spin is that he could treat them like Calibolt, stretch out the jagged edges of Rule Breaker and turn it into an actual arrow. He turns that arrow into a broken phantasm, making up for the rank that he lost via its projection, and now he has something that's even more devastating than the original. We'll call these the false Rule Breaker arrows. He could get saucy with it. He could use it at close range and it would still have the same effect. Again, the point of the phantasm isn't the strength, it is the effect, so it still works. You couldn't even fight him up close without worrying about him taking your powers. In fact, the circumstance reminds me a lot of Bazette's phantasm, Frog Rock. You don't want to use your best move because then she's just gonna turn around and use it against you as a counter. Same thing with Herc's Pandora. But we can take this a step further and still get the real thing. So let's say by chance that he ends up working alongside Medea. What do you know? That's an actual canon circumstance back in UB-Dub when he did his fake out of going to her side. Let's say that he actually remained on her side and he wasn't just pretending, and she offers the original Rule Breaker for him. Next, he would need somebody that could craft the arrows and the bullets, that being somebody with item construction. Again, we can use Medea. She has A rank in this skill. This part is essential considering that EMIYA's profession is specifically what's in UB-Dub, but in terms of making making quality ammunition that's never been shown to be his thing. So Medea makes this instead. She crushes up the original blade of the rule breaker and then reconstructs it to make arrowheads. He forms the base of these arrowheads by using a sword, and in unison they make a true rule breaker arrow. He can now store that data in UB-Dub for instant use. Instead of just carrying around the arrows, they'll just be recognized as an alternate version of Medea's rule breaker. Same thing goes for EMIYA Alter and his bullets. She crushes up the OG rule breaker and reforms them as bullets. He stores them as an alternate form, and now he has access to it on the fly. Just the thought of this idea is wild enough on its own, and it really still could get much worse. Had EMIYA been able to contact Hephaestus and they had a divine construct on hand, they could have offered rule breaker and turned it into these sort of divine construct arrows and bullets. This would automatically put his projectiles in a new territory. Since rule breaker doesn't capitalize on its power in the first place, literally any divine construct that he decides to fuse with it would only make the phantasm go up, possibly even gaining the ability of said construct. So could he pull this off? I believe so. He just needs for a proper way to go about this, because he couldn't do it on his own. Even he has his limitations. But you throw one person in the mix, him gaining access to the Kaleidostic or him gaining access to Medea's OG rule breaker, then you got a serious issue. And there's many spins that you can put on this idea as well. It's not just for rule breaker. I'm sure somebody's gonna say, well, does that mean that he can project 50,000 Excalibur images? No, he would still explode. At the very best, he could do what EMIYA and Miyu did in Prisma EMIYA, which is multiply the power of one Excalibur and use it that way. That's how they took down Hurt. And even considering that, it would still take an enormous amount of energy for him to do so, since this would be outside the Prismaverse. But I have seen somebody bring up something that's actually plausible, and that's him projecting Caliburn, which we know is extremely powerful in its own right. He could do the same with that phantasm. It really could get mixy. And just like that, instead of going for one of the best weapons to ever exist and just blowing himself up, he could go for the next best thing and still come out with an efficient second version. And there's plenty of them. There's Grom, there's Durandal, pretty much anything from the Round or the Paladins, that would be perfect. It really just depends on what he decides to go for. It doesn't even have to be something strong. It could be something like Rule Breaker, where he's just pillaging the effect, reinforcing his arrows with the elements, or anything of that nature. The big divide here is that beyond just using their originals and projecting just one of them, he can do this and shoot out multiple of them at the same time. Khonsho and Bakia is one of the only anomalies where he wouldn't need this.